The year is 1929. Inside the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a librarian named Halil Edom is conducting a routine inventory of the imperial archives, a collection of thousands of documents accumulated over centuries of Ottoman rule. Most of what he finds is unremarkable. Administrative records, trade correspondence, maps of known territories. Then he opens a folder that has not been touched in decades. Inside, a document drawn on gazelle skin, measuring roughly 90 by 65 centimeters. It is a nautical map, a portolan chart, painted in rich colors, annotated in Ottoman Turkish and Arabic, and dated, in the margin, to the month of Muharram in the year 919 of the Islamic calendar. That corresponds, in the Western calendar, to 1513 AD. The map is signed by its maker. His name, Piri Reis, Ottoman admiral, navigator, and cartographer. And somewhere along its southern edge, Piri Reis drew a landmass that, according to every accepted principle of historical geography, he should have had absolutely no knowledge of. It would take decades before the full weight of that detail became clear. When it did, it would divide historians, cartographers, and scientists into two camps, and leave a question that has never been fully resolved. The map that shouldn't exist drawn in 1513. It shows Antarctica without ice. To understand the map, you must first understand the man who made it. His name at birth was Ahmet Muhyiddin Piri. History knows him as Piri Reis, Piri the Admiral, one of the most accomplished navigators of the Ottoman Empire. Born around 1465 in the Aegean port city of Gallipoli, Piri came from a seafaring family. His uncle, Kemal Reis, was a celebrated corsair and naval commander who sailed the western Mediterranean with a fearlessness that made him famous across the Islamic world. From an early age, Piri sailed alongside his uncle. He learned the geometry of the sea, how currents moved, how winds shifted, how the horizon changed with latitude. He learned to read charts and, more importantly, to make them. By the early 1500s, Piri Reis had participated in multiple naval campaigns across the Mediterranean and the Atlantic coast of North Africa. He had access, through trade, through conquest, through the intellectual networks of the Ottoman court, to an extraordinary range of geographical knowledge. He was not merely a sailor. He was a scholar of navigation. In 1513, he completed the map that would eventually bear his name. And in the margins of that map, he wrote something remarkable. According to the surviving text, Piri Reis states that he compiled his map from approximately 20 different source maps, some dating back to the era of Alexander the Great, some drawn by Portuguese explorers, and at least one attributed to Christopher Columbus himself. He writes, and this is documented, that he had access to a map Columbus used during his western voyages. That detail alone would make the Piri Reis map historically significant. But it is not why historians and scientists have spent nearly a century arguing over it. The argument begins at the bottom of the map. That coastline, rendered in 1513, appears to show a continent in the southern polar region. A continent that, according to the official historical record, was not discovered until 1820, 307 years later. In 1513, no European expedition had ever crossed the Antarctic Circle. The continent of Antarctica would not receive its first confirmed sighting until the early 19th century, with expeditions led by Fabian von Bellingshausen, Edward Bransfield, and Nathaniel Palmer converging on the region within months of each other in 1820 and 1821. Before that date, the existence of a southern polar landmass was theoretical at best. A philosophical concept called terra australis incognita, the unknown southern land, hypothesized by ancient Greek thinkers who believed symmetry demanded a large landmass in the south to balance the continents of the north. It was an idea, a conjecture, not a mapped territory. And yet, on the Piri Reis map of 1513, the southern edge of the chart shows a continuous landmass with distinct geographical features, bays, inlets, peninsulas, drawn with the same documentary confidence as the European and African coastlines above it. When researchers in the 20th century began comparing this coastline to modern maps of Antarctica, they noticed something deeply unsettling. The shape, particularly the section corresponding to what we now call Queen Maud Land on the Antarctic coast, appear to match the actual subglacial topography of that region with a degree of accuracy that seemed, to some analysts, far too specific to be coincidental. Here is the problem. The coastline of Antarctica as it appears today, the rocky, ice-free coastline beneath the Antarctic ice sheet, has only been mapped through modern seismic surveys and ground-penetrating radar, the most recent and comprehensive of which were completed in the late 20th century. The ice sheet covering Antarctica is, in most places, between 1.6 and 4.7 kilometers thick. The last time any portion of the Antarctic coast is believed to have been ice-free, based on current geological and paleoclimatological data, was approximately 6,000 years ago. If the southern coastline on the Piri Reis map is indeed a representation of Antarctica, drawn with accuracy that suggests direct observation rather than speculation, then whoever produced the original source map that Piri Reis copied from would have needed to survey that coastline when it was still free of ice. That is what makes this map, to those who take it seriously, not just unusual. It is what makes it, potentially, one of the most consequential artifacts in the history of human civilization. But before we reach that conclusion, we need to ask a more fundamental question. What did the world actually know in 1513? And how much of what we think we know about that era might be wrong? To appreciate how extraordinary the Piri Reis map truly is, you need to stand inside the geographical knowledge of 1513, and understand precisely how limited it was. Columbus had made his first voyage to the Americas only 21 years earlier, in 1492. The continent he had reached was still being mapped, still being understood. Most European cartographers in 1513 still disagreed about the true shape of the Western Hemisphere. Vasco da Gama had rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India via the Eastern Sea Route in 1498, just 15 years before Piri Reis completed his map. The coastlines of sub-Saharan Africa were still being charted in real time by Portuguese expeditions. The Pacific Ocean had not yet been crossed by a European. Magellan would not complete his circumnavigation of the globe until 1522, 9 years after the Piri Reis map was drawn. In this context, the Piri Reis map is already remarkable for what it gets right. The Atlantic coastlines of Europe and Africa are rendered with impressive accuracy. The eastern coast of South America, particularly Brazil, which had been reached by Pedro Alvarez Cabral in 1500, follows the actual geography with a precision that indicates Piri Reis had access to quality Portuguese charts. The Caribbean islands are identifiable. Several internal geographical features of the African continent, though approximate, are not wildly inaccurate by the standards of the time. For a map drawn in 1513, this is exactly what we would expect from a careful, well-sourced cartographer working from the best available Portuguese and Spanish charts of the era. Then we reach the bottom edge. The southern portion of the map diverges radically from what any cartographer of 1513 should have been able to draw. South America curves east and then south. Then, below a gap that some researchers interpret as the Drake Passage, the body of water separating South America from Antarctica, a landmass begins. It continues across the bottom of the map in an unbroken line. The latitude placement of this southern landmass, when corrected for the cartographic projection used in the original chart, places it in the approximate position of Antarctica. Not in the tropics. Not in the mid-latitudes. At the bottom of the world. In 1513. How do we explain this? That question has occupied some of the sharpest minds in historical research for nearly a century. And the answers, every single one of them, raise more questions than they resolve. The most important clue Piri Reis left behind is not the map itself. It is what he wrote in the margins. In his own hand, in Ottoman Turkish, Piri Reis explains his methodology. He describes, with unusual specificity for the era, the sources he used to construct the map. He mentions Portuguese charts, acquired, historical records suggest, through naval intelligence during Ottoman-Portuguese conflicts in the Indian Ocean. He mentions the map carried by Christopher Columbus, a claim that has fascinated historians for decades, since Columbus's own charts have never been recovered. He mentions Arab geographical manuscripts, texts preserving knowledge from the Islamic Golden Age, when scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba had compiled and extended the geographical work of ancient Greek thinkers. And then he writes something that has become the most debated sentence in the entire document. Piri Reis states that some of his source maps date back to the time of Alexander the Great, the 4th century BC. He does not name these maps. He does not describe who made them or how they survived. He simply states that they existed, and that he used them. This is where the speculation begins, and where serious historians urge the greatest caution. If there existed, in the ancient world, a tradition of geographical knowledge that has since been entirely lost, maps compiled by unknown navigators at a time when the Antarctic coast was still accessible, still ice-free, then the Piri Reis map might represent the final echo of that knowledge, filtered through centuries of copying, reinterpreting, and translating, but preserving, in distorted form, the outline of a continent no one in 1513 had any reason to draw. This theory was most forcefully argued by Charles Hapgood, an American historian who published a detailed analysis of the Piri Reis map in 1966, titled Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings. Hapgood argued that the map's accuracy, particularly its apparent use of a spherical projection that would not be formally rediscovered in Western cartography until the 20th century, pointed to the existence of a prehistorical maritime civilization capable of circumnavigating the globe and charting its coastlines. Some historians found Hapgood's work compelling. Others found it deeply problematic. The debate would intensify dramatically when, in 1960, an unexpected voice entered the conversation. Not a historian. Not an archaeologist. A United States Air Force officer. In 1959, a copy of the Piri Reis map reached the desk of Captain Lorenzo Burroughs, chief of the cartographic section at Westover Air Force Base in Massachusetts. Burroughs passed it to his superior, Brigadier General Harold Z. Ohlmeyer, commander of the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron, a unit whose professional expertise lay in the precise analysis of aerial and cartographic data. What Ohlmeyer's team did next was not mystical. It was not speculative. It was technical. Using the tools of mid-20th century military cartography, Ohlmeyer's team analyzed the Piri Reis map with a specific question in mind. What projection system was used to construct it, and how accurately does the southern coastline correspond to known geography when that projection is properly applied? On July 6, 1960, Brigadier General Ohlmeyer sent a letter to Charles Hapgood at Keene State College in New Hampshire. The letter is part of the historical record. It has been reproduced in academic publications and is cited in discussions of the map to this day. In it, Ohlmeyer writes, and these are documented words, not paraphrase, that the team's analysis found the southern coastline of the Piri Reis map to be in remarkable agreement with the seismic profile of the subglacial topography of Antarctica as established by the Swedish-British-Norwegian expedition of 1949. The 1949 expedition had used seismic technology to map, for the first time, the actual rock surface of Antarctica beneath its ice sheet. It was the first time in modern history that the true subglacial coastline of the continent had been documented. Ohlmeyer's conclusion: the southern coastline on the 1513 map appeared to correspond more closely to that sub-ice geography than to the ice-covered coastline visible above the surface. In other words, if the Piri Reis map was showing Antarctica at all, it appeared to be showing the continent as it would look without its ice. Ohlmeyer's letter ends with a sentence that has been quoted and debated ever since. He writes that the accuracy of the chart suggests the original source maps were compiled at a time when the Antarctic coast was free of ice, and that, from a technical cartographic standpoint, his team could not explain this. A U.S. Air Force cartography unit. A professional assessment. A documented letter. The academic world could not simply dismiss it. But it also could not accept it without challenge. Science does not operate on dramatic correspondence alone. And for every analyst who found the Piri Reis map's southern coastline compelling, there were cartographers and historians who looked at the same data and reached very different conclusions. Their arguments are serious, technically grounded, and deserve the same attention as the claims they oppose. The first and most fundamental objection concerns cartographic projection. The Piri Reis map was not drawn using any single, consistent projection system. Like most Portolan charts of the era, it was compiled from multiple source maps, each potentially drawn with different orientation, scale, and distortion. When you assemble a map from 20 different sources, as Piri Reis himself describes, the resulting composite will contain accumulated errors, distortions, and discontinuities. Several modern cartographers have argued that the apparent correspondence between the southern coastline on the Piri Reis map and the subglacial Antarctic topography is the result of selective comparison, choosing the portions of the coastline that match and ignoring the substantial portions that don't. The second objection concerns terra australis incognita. By 1513, the concept of a large southern continent was well established in European intellectual culture. It appeared on many maps of the era, not as a result of direct observation, but as a theoretical construct. Some cartographers of the period included large, vaguely shaped southern landmasses as a matter of geographical convention. Skeptical historians argue that the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map may simply be one of these conventional additions, perhaps influenced by early, imprecise Portuguese reports of sailing into high southern latitudes, and that its apparent resemblance to Antarctica is coincidental. The third objection is perhaps the most technically specific. When Dr. Hapgood and Ohlmeyer's team performed their analysis, they were working with the Antarctic seismic data available in 1960. Since then, the subglacial topography of Antarctica has been mapped with vastly greater precision. Several subsequent researchers have performed updated comparisons of the Piri Reis coastline against this more accurate modern data, and found the correspondence to be significantly less striking than Hapgood claimed. In a peer-reviewed assessment published in the journal Skeptical Inquirer, cartographic historian Gregory McIntosh conducted one of the most thorough analyses of the map to date. His conclusion: the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map most likely represents a misplaced and distorted South America, specifically Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, stretched and rotated as a result of projection errors, rather than a separate Antarctic continent. This is not a fringe dismissal. It is a serious, documented scholarly argument based on technical cartographic analysis. And yet the question does not close. Because for every methodological objection raised by the skeptics, there remain details in the map, specific geographical features, the placement of certain bays, the overall curvature of the southern coastline, that some researchers continue to find difficult to explain away entirely. The Piri Reis map does not prove the existence of a lost civilization. But it has not been fully explained, either. And that gap, between what we can prove and what we cannot dismiss, is precisely where this story lives. The Piri Reis map has been in the Topkapi Palace collection for 5 centuries. It has been examined by cartographers, historians, military analysts, archaeologists, geologists, and paleoclimatologists. It has been the subject of academic papers, popular books, documentary films, and heated debates at international conferences. It has been called proof of a lost civilization. It has been called an interesting but explicable artifact of 16th-century cartography. It has been called both things simultaneously by different researchers working from the same data. Here is what we know with certainty. Piri Reis was a real person, a documented Ottoman admiral and cartographer of considerable skill. The map was drawn in 1513. It was compiled from multiple sources, some of which Piri Reis described but did not fully identify. It contains a southern landmass whose precise nature, Antarctic continent, distorted South America, or theoretical terra australis, remains genuinely debated among specialists. We know that the official discovery of Antarctica did not occur until 1820. We know that the subglacial topography of Antarctica, the rock beneath the ice, was not mapped until 1949. We know that a U.S. Air Force cartography team found the map's southern coastline sufficiently striking to document their findings in a formal letter. We also know that serious cartographic historians have offered detailed technical explanations for the map's southern coastline that do not require any anomalous source material. Both of these things are true. What we do not know is who drew the source maps that Piri Reis compiled. We do not know what was in the geographical archives available to Ottoman scholars in the early 16th century. We do not know what was lost when the Library of Alexandria burned, or in the centuries of destruction, migration, and forgetting that preceded and followed it. We do not know with certainty whether the southern coastline on the Piri Reis map is a coincidence, a distortion, or a memory. History is not only the story of what happened. It is also the story of what was recorded, what survived, what was copied, and what was lost. The Piri Reis map, in a sense, is a document about all four of those things simultaneously. It tells us what one man knew, or believed he knew, in 1513. It tells us that his sources stretched back further than his own lifetime, possibly much further. It tells us that geographical knowledge in the ancient and medieval world traveled along routes we have not fully traced. And it shows us, in its lower margin, a coastline that history says should not be there. Whether that coastline is Antarctica, or a distorted echo of Patagonia, or something else entirely, the map exists. The debate exists. And the source maps Piri Reis consulted have never been found.